The village of Hawthorne Hollow was, by all accounts, a place of serenity, nestled between rolling green hills and bordered by an ancient woodland. It had the charm of an old painting quaint cottages with ivy-clad walls, a village green where children played, and a church that stood as a silent sentinel over generations of births, marriages, and burials. On this fine summer afternoon, the vicarage gardens were in full bloom, providing the perfect backdrop for the annual charity fete, an event that drew together villagers from all walks of life. The fete was a tradition, overseen with great efficiency by the vicar's wife, Mrs. Winifred Pembroke, who ran it as though organizing a military campaign. Everything was in order. The tea tent overflowed with freshly baked cakes. The raffle table displayed an assortment of prizes ranging from a hand-knitted tea cozy to a bottle of Colonel Marchbank's rather dubious homemade sherry, and the air was filled with laughter and chatter. It was, in all appearances, a perfectly ordinary village gathering. Miss Jane Marple sat at the edge of the festivities, quietly observing the comings and goings of her fellow attendees. A woman of genteel manner and seemingly frail appearance, she was often overlooked in such gatherings. This suited her well. From her shaded spot beneath the chestnut tree, she listened attentively to the snippets of conversation floating on the summer breeze. "Mark my words, there's something not quite right about Mr. Endicott," Mrs. Weatherby, the butcher's wife, whispered to her friend, Mrs. Willoughby, as they loitered near the tea stand. "Accounts don't simply misplace themselves, do they?" "Oh, don't be ridiculous," Mrs. Willoughby sniffed, adjusting her lace gloves. "Harold Endicott may be forgetful, but he's no thief. Besides, Miss Lavinia is the one to ask if anyone has her eye on the church finances. It's her." Miss Lavinia Bradshaw was a woman of considerable means and influence in Hawthorne Hollow. A lady of independent wealth, as they politely put it. She had long held the village in the palm of her hand with her generous donations. Sharp-witted, fastidious, and not without her own brand of ruthlessness, she was not one to suffer fools gladly. "She was here a moment ago," said Mrs. Weatherby, craning her neck. "Speaking with that young woman. What's her name?" "The new school teacher. Miss Howard." "Yes, Miss Evelyn Howard." "Quite an odd conversation, if you ask me." Miss Marple, stirring a lump of sugar into her tea, watched as Mrs. Weatherby pursed her lips in that particular way that meant she was about to divulge something particularly juicy. "I was passing by the rose bushes," she continued, lowering her voice, "and I distinctly heard Miss Lavinia say, 'I don't care what you think. This is a matter for me to decide.'" And the poor girl looked as if she might cry. Miss Marple's brow lifted slightly. Interesting. Before she could consider the matter further, a commotion erupted near the raffle table. Mr. Harold Endicott, the church treasurer, was engaged in a rather tense exchange with Miss Evelyn Howard, who appeared flustered and on the verge of tears. "I don't understand what you're suggesting, Mr. Endicott," she said, shaking her head. "You must understand," he replied, his face red with agitation. "I have no choice but to bring it to Miss Bradshaw's attention. She already knows." Miss Howard interrupted, her voice barely above a whisper, before either could say another word. A piercing scream shattered the gentle hum of the fete. Gasps rippled through the crowd as a young maid, white as a sheet, stumbled from the vicarage, clutching her apron with trembling hands. It's Miss Lavinia," she cried, eyes wide with terror. She's dead." Fate froze. A collective moment of shock passed over the gathered villagers before they surged toward the vicarage in a panicked cluster. Murmuring in horror, Mrs. Pembroke clutched her husband's arm. "Dead," she repeated faintly. "But how, Colonel?" Marchbanks, a retired military man with a taste for brandy and unsolicited opinions, took charge. "Everyone stay calm," he bellowed, though he himself looked somewhat rattled. Let's not rush in all at once. Miss Marple did not rush in at all. She remained seated, her bright blue eyes keen as they scanned the expressions of those around her. It was in these first moments, she had learned, that the truth often revealed itself if one knew how to look. Evelyn Howard's face had gone ashen. Harold Endicott gripped his raffle ticket as though it might suddenly explode. Mrs. Weatherby, for all her love of gossip, looked genuinely horrified. The maid, barely able to string words together, pointed toward the vicar's study. "She's in there," she stammered. Colonel Marchbanks and Dr. Geoffrey Blake, the village physician, stepped inside, while the others hovered anxiously near the entrance. A few minutes passed before Dr. Blake re-emerged, his expression grave. "Miss Bradshaw is dead," he confirmed, rubbing his chin. "It looks as though she collapsed at the desk, but I'll need a closer examination." A murmur swept through the crowd. How dreadful. A heart attack she was getting on in years. But Miss Marple was already thinking ahead. Sudden deaths in English villages were rarely what they seemed. Dr. Blake reappeared, brow furrowed. "I can't be sure just yet, but I suspect poison." Another, deeper hush fell. Poison, a crime of deliberation. Someone in this very crowd had planned it. Miss Marple, still seated, turned her attention back to the villagers, watching the reactions of each person carefully. Suspicion, fear, feigned surprise, all played out in a delicate dance of expressions, and so a real investigation began. Evening fell over Hawthorne Hollow with an unsettling hush. The remnants of the garden fate half-eaten cakes, overturned teacups, and an abandoned raffle drum stood as ghostly relics of the afternoon's tragedy. What had begun as a day of jovial chatter had ended in whispers of suspicion and fear. The vicarage was still buzzing with activity. The police had cordoned off the study where Miss Lavinia Bradshaw had met her untimely end. Inspector Arthur Graves, a man of thick-set build and an even thicker patience, had established his temporary headquarters in the vicar's sitting room, where a growing list of names and statements cluttered his notepad. Miss Marple had remained at the garden's edge, her gloved hands folded neatly in her lap, taking in the aftermath as it unfolded. She had seen death before, more than most in the village might suspect, and she understood how the first ripples of a crime could often reveal more than the evidence left behind. Inside the vicarage, Inspector Graves let out a weary sigh as he flipped through his notes. Opposite him sat Harold Endicott, the church treasurer, who was shifting uncomfortably in his chair. "So, Mr. Endicott," the inspector began tapping his pencil against the edge of his notebook, "you were the last person to speak with Miss Bradshaw before she entered the vicarage." "That's correct," Inspector Endicott replied, pushing his glasses up the bridge of his nose. She seemed quite determined. She had strong opinions about how the church funds should be allocated, and she made it clear that she wouldn't be swayed. Graves studied him carefully. He did that disagreement escalate. Endicott's Adam's apple bobbed as he swallowed. No more than usual. Miss Bradshaw was known for her sharp tongue, but that was simply her way. "I would never," he hesitated, realizing the implication of his words. "That is to say, I had no reason to wish her harm." The inspector made a non-committal grunt and jotted down a few more notes. "And Miss Evelyn Howard, she also spoke with her earlier today." "Yes," Endicott confirmed. "Condi, they seemed to have quite the serious conversation in the garden. Couldn't hear what was said, but Miss Howard was rather pale afterward. That, of course, aligned with what Miss Marple had already overheard earlier in the day." Inspector Graves called for Evelyn Howard next. The young schoolteacher entered hesitantly, her fingers twisting the hem of her cardigan. "You spoke with Miss Bradshaw before her death," Graves said, watching her reaction closely. "Yes, Inspector," she said quietly. "It was a private matter." "Everything becomes public when murder is involved, Miss Howard," he replied, Please, elaborate. Evelyn hesitated, then drew a deep breath. I had hoped to appeal to Miss Bradshaw for assistance. A personal matter one she had the ability to help with. And did she agree? There was a pause. Then, barely above a whisper, Evelyn admitted, no. A heavy silence hung between them. And you were upset by this? She met his gaze with sudden defiance. Yes, Inspector, I was. But that does not mean I had anything to do with her death. Outside, Miss Marple observed the young woman as she emerged from the sitting room. Her hands trembled as she smoothed her skirt, her jaw tight with barely concealed emotion. Miss Marple had always believed that people showed their truest selves in the wake of tragedy. And Evelyn Howard, for all her nervousness, was carrying something heavier than simple grief. As the evening deepened, villagers gathered at the Green Man, the local inn, their usual chatter subdued. The air was thick with speculation. Poison, Colonel Marchbanks muttered into his whiskey glass. Particularly nasty way to go. Takes forethought. Planning. That means this wasn't some crime of passions. Someone wanted her dead, and they knew exactly how to do it. She had enemies, Mrs. Weatherby said in a hushed tone. Not that she'd ever admit it, mind you, but there were plenty in the village who found her difficult. Difficult is one thing, said the innkeeper, Mr. Hargreaves, leaning on the bar. Murderous is quite another. At a corner table, Miss Marple sat quietly with her tea. Listening, it was a well-known fact that Miss Bradshaw had controlled the village's charitable donations with an iron grip. She decided which causes were worthy, which families deserved help, and perhaps, most significantly, who did not. Could it be, Miss Marple mused, that her generosity had bred resentment rather than gratitude? The next morning, the vicarage remained under the police's watchful eye. Inspector Graves had sent the teacup for analysis, though he strongly suspected it had been the vessel for Miss Bradshaw's untimely demise. As he combed through the room, something small but significant caught his eye in an envelope tucked beneath a pile of papers on the desk. He unfolded it carefully, his brow furrowing as he read. It was a will, and not just any will. It was dated only 3 days ago. His eyes scanned the document quickly, his pulse quickening. Miss Bradshaw had named a new beneficiary, someone who, if this document was to be believed, stood to gain quite a bit from her sudden death, and that someone was not who he expected. Outside the vicarage, Miss Marple took a slow stroll around the garden, stopping by the very rose bush where Evelyn Howard had stood the day before. She bent slightly, studying the disturbed earth beneath the foliage. A small, crumpled scrap of paper lay near the roots. Retrieving it with careful fingers, she smoothed it out, her keen blue eyes narrowing. It was a torn corner of a letter, written in a distinct, sharp hand. Cannot allow this to continue. You must see reason before it is too late. Miss Marple read the fragment twice before slipping it into her pocket. She turned toward the vicarage, her face unreadable. There were secrets at play here, secrets that Miss Lavinia Bradshaw had discovered. Too late, and somewhere in the quiet village of Hawthorne Hollow, a person who had silenced her forever was watching, waiting. Hawthorne Hollow awoke to a village in mourning, or rather, a village in speculation. The news of Miss Lavinia Bradshaw's murder had spread like wildfire, and the tight-knit community was now brimming with hushed conversations behind lace-curtained windows and hurried exchanges at the greengrocer's. The question on everyone's lips was the same. Who had reason to kill her? At the vicarage, Inspector Graves sat at the vicar's writing desk. The freshly discovered will spread before him. It's a last testament, dated only 3 days prior. The significance of it was impossible to ignore. Miss Bradshaw had altered that very fabric of her affairs mere hours before her untimely death. But why? And more importantly, who had stood to gain? By mid-morning, those named in the will had been summoned to the vicarage. The deceased long-time solicitor, Mr. Albert Forsyth, a balding, meticulous man with pince-nez spectacles, had arrived from market chipping to execute his grim duty. Seated in the drawing room, the gathered individuals reflected the many facets of Miss Bradshaw's life. Harold Endicott, the church treasurer, sat rigidly, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. Evelyn Howard, the young schoolteacher, perched anxiously at the edge of her chair, her fingers twisted together. Mrs. Pembroke, the vicar's wife, wore a tight, apprehensive expression, and Colonel Marchbanks, never one to miss an event of importance, leaned back with his arms folded, observing the proceedings with hooded eyes. Miss Marple, invited as a matter of course, her presence, now regarded as something of an inevitability in such matters, sat quietly, her hands resting on her lap, her eyes watchful beneath her neatly feathered hat. "Now then," Mr. Forsyth began, clearing his throat. "Miss Bradshaw's most recent will is a straightforward document, revised only a few days ago. It supersedes all previous versions and reflects her final wishes." The room collectively held its breath. As expected, the majority of her estate, her home savings, and certain investments is to be donated to the Church Restoration Fund. Harold Endicott let out a small sigh of relief. "Well, that was always her intention," he murmured. "However," Forsyth continued, raising a hand, "there is one significant change. The entirety of her personal fortuna, sum of roughly £15,000, has been bequeathed to Miss Evelyn Howard." A shocked silence filled the room. Evelyn paled visibly. "What?" she breathed. Colonel Marchbanks let out a low whistle. Well, he muttered. "Didn't see that coming." Inspector Graves, whose interest had sharpened considerably, laced his fingers together. "Miss Howard, were you aware of this change?" Evelyn shook her head violently. "No, I had no idea. Why on earth would she leave me anything at all?" "Is precisely what I'd like to know," Graves said, his gaze unwavering, "especially given that you were one of the last people to speak with her before she died." Evelyn's eyes darted across the room, as if searching for an escape. "I told you, I asked for her help, but she refused me. Why would she change her will in my favor?" Mrs. Pembroke, who had remained silent up until now, cleared her throat. "It is rather unusual," she admitted carefully. Miss Bradshaw was not known for impulsive generosity. She made such a decision, she must have had good reason. Miss Marple, who had been watching Evelyn with quiet interest, finally spoke. "It does seem rather curious, doesn't it?" she mused. "To refuse a request, yet leave such a generous sum. I might even wonder if she had a change of heart perhaps after learning something new." Evelyn swallowed. "I don't know what to say. I never expected this." Inspector Graves gave her a long, appraising look. "For your sake, Miss Howard, I hope that's true." By midday, the revelation of the will had spread, and the village was abuzz with conflicting theories. "Well, that's it then," Mrs. Weatherby declared over a fresh pot of tea at the Green Man. "She must have done it. Who else would have reason?" Mrs. Willoughby sniffed. "It does seem rather convenient, doesn't it?" Mr. Hargreaves, the innkeeper, shook his head. Now, we mustn't jump to conclusions. There's more to this than meets the eye, I'd wager." Miss Marple, who had stopped by for a quiet cup of tea, smiled faintly. "Mr. Hargreaves is quite right. Money, you see, is often the most obvious motives, but not necessarily the correct one. I rather think we should ask why Miss Bradshaw made such a change. That might lead us to something far more illuminating." And indeed, Miss Marple had already begun forming a hypothesis, one that had little to do with money at all. That evening, Miss Marple sat in her own parlor, turning over the crumpled scrap of paper she had retrieved from beneath the rosebush. "Cannot allow this to continue, Kay. You must see reason before it is too late." The handwriting was sharp, distinct, a woman's hand, most likely. The phrasing intrigued her. Not a direct threat, but a plea, an insistence. Who had written it? More importantly, what had Miss Bradshaw been warned about? Early the next morning, Miss Marple visited the vicarage once more, where Alice, the maid, was still deeply shaken. "You must have seen many things in Miss Bradshaw's household," Miss Marple said kindly, watching the girl's fidgeting hands. "A woman like Hershey was bound to have visitors, disagreements." Alice hesitated. She had arguments, yes, she admitted, but there was one just a few nights ago, a very heated one. Miss Marple's brows lifted. "Oh," Alice bit her lip. "With someone, I couldn't see who. It was late, after supper. I was clearing dishes when I heard raised voices from the study. Miss Bradshaw was angry. She said something about putting a stop to it before things went too far." Miss Marple leaned in slightly. "And the other person? A man? A woman?" Alice hesitated. "A woman, I think." But she was speaking so low, I couldn't make out the words. Miss Marple's gaze sharpened. Secret confrontation, just days before the murder. A desperate plea, written but never sent. And a will, changed at the last moment. The pieces were beginning to form a pattern, and somewhere within that pattern lay the truth. Hawthorne Hollow was a village of unspoken truths, where grievances festered behind polite smiles and secrets lurked beneath the surface of ordinary life. Miss Marple had lived long enough to know that beneath the veneer of civility, every village harbored its own tangled web of resentments, alliances, and betrayals. Miss Lavinia Bradshaw had been many things: sharp-tongued, formidable, and exacting in her judgment. Yet she had also been deeply woven into the fabric of the community. Her sudden, violent death had left a void, not just of influence, but of knowledge. Someone had silenced her, and Miss Marple was determined to find out why. The following morning, Miss Marple took a leisurely walk through the village, greeting familiar faces with polite inquiries into their health and general well-being. Few would suspect that her casual conversation was anything but idle chatter. Her walk led her past the vicarage and toward the home of Mrs. Pembroke, the vicar's wife. The woman was standing at her front gate, her gloved hands clasped tightly together, her usually composed expression unusually tense. "Miss Marple," she greeted with a faint smile. "What a troubling time this has been." "Indeed," Miss Marple replied, her sharp eyes taking in the slight tremor in the woman's fingers. "One forgets how very unsettling such a thing can be, even for those not directly involved." Mrs. Pembroke hesitated before speaking. I shouldn't say this, but I do worry about Evelyn Howard. The will, you see? People are talking." Miss Marple nodded. "Yes, they do that, don't they? And yet things are rarely as straightforward as they appear." Mrs. Pembroke sighed. "Lavinia could be difficult, but I cannot imagine why anyone would go so far as to poison her. But if Evelyn had no idea she had been made a beneficiary, it does make one wonder why Lavinia chose her in the first place." "It's a very pertinent question," Miss Marple agreed, her mind already considering the possibilities. Miss Marple's next stop was the Green Man, the village inn where Inspector Graves had taken up temporary residence. She found him in the corner, scowling at his notes over a pot of strong tea. "Ah, Miss Marple," he said gruffly as she approached. "I suppose you're here to offer your insights." "Only a few observations, Inspector," she said pleasantly, taking a seat opposite him. Graves sighed. "Go on, then." She folded her hands neatly. "It occurs to me that Miss Bradshaw's change of will was not merely generous, but deliberate. And yet, she told no one, least of all Miss Howard herself. Why?" Graves frowned. "You think she intended to reveal it later?" "Perhaps. Or perhaps she had reason to believe Miss Howard needed that money." The inspector drummed his fingers on the table. "You think she was helping her?" Miss Marple smiled. "Not necessarily out of kindness. Lavinia Bradshaw was a woman who did nothing without purpose. She left that money to Miss Howard. It was either a repayment of something or a way to control something. Graves grunted. And that scrap of paper you found? The warning? Miss Marple tilted her head. A woman's hand. I believe, in a tone of desperation rather than anger. A plea, not a threat. Graves muttered. So someone knew something dangerous was afoot, and Miss Bradshaw ignored it. Precisely, Miss Marple agreed. Now the question is, what was she refusing to see? Later that day, Miss Marple found herself at the village green, where she spotted Evelyn Howard sitting alone on a bench. The young woman looked pale and drawn, her fingers worrying the fabric of her skirt. Miss Marple settled beside her. It's been rather an ordeal, hasn't it, my dear? Evelyn gave a brittle laugh. That's an understatement, Miss Marple. I don't even know what to think anymore. Miss Marple's voice remained gentle. I imagine you were quite surprised by Miss Bradshaw's bequest. Evelyn nodded, shocked. Really? I don't understand it. We weren't friends, okay? She barely tolerated me. Miss Marple regarded her thoughtfully, okay? And yet, you went to her for help. That takes courage. Evelyn looked away. She refused me, but later changed her mind, it seems. Evelyn swallowed hard. She did. She never told me. Miss Marple's keen eyes studied her. My dear, did you ever feel that Miss Bradshaw was watching you, taking an interest in your affairs more than seemed necessary? Evelyn flinched slightly. She always made me uneasy, if that's what you mean. She had this way of looking at you like she saw everything. I felt like she knew things about me I hadn't even told her. Miss Marple nodded, her suspicions confirming themselves. Miss Bradshaw had indeed known something, and someone had made sure she would never speak of it. By late afternoon, Miss Marple had taken tea with several village ladies, each conversation bringing her closer to an understanding of the crime. But it was not what had been said that interested her most, it was what had been left out. One name had not been mentioned, despite its obvious relevance. Tell me, she asked Mrs. Weatherby over a slice of Victoria sponge, has anyone spoken with Harold Endicott since the reading of the will? Mrs. Weatherby frowned. Why, no? Now that you mention it, I don't believe he's been seen all day. Miss Marple sipped her tea. How very intriguing. For while everyone's attention had been drawn toward Evelyn Howard, one person had quietly slipped from view, and that, in Miss Marple's experience, was rarely a coincidence. That evening, Inspector Graves knocked at the door of Harold Endicott's cottage, only to find it locked and bolted. A neighbor reported seeing him leave that morning hurriedly, and with a suitcase stopped by nightfall. Graves sent a man to check Market Chipping Station. The report came back swiftly. Harold Endicott had purchased a ticket out of town. Inspector Graves turned to Miss Marple. Looks like you were right about him. Miss Marple's expression remained mild. Oh, I never said he was guilty, Inspector. I merely thought it odd that he should disappear so suddenly. Graves snorted. In my experience, the innocent don't run. Miss Marple smiled faintly. Oh, but they do. The guilty inspector know how to stay very, very still. Somewhere, she was certain, the real murderer was watching, waiting content in the knowledge that suspicion had settled elsewhere, but not for long. The news of Harold Endicott's sudden departure spread quickly through Hawthorne Hollow, setting tongues wagging and imaginations running wild. In a village where even a missing cat was considered noteworthy, a man fleeing on the very heels of a murder investigation was a sensation. Inspector Graves had wasted no time dispatching men to track him down. By late afternoon, word came from Market Chipping Station. Endicott had purchased a ticket for London, but had never boarded the train. He's hiding, Graves muttered, pacing the vicarage study. The question is, where? Miss Marple, seated calmly across from him, delicately folded her hands. I rather think the question is why he ran at all, Inspector. Running implies fear, but fear of what? Graves stopped, turning to her with a sigh. Well, Miss Marple, unless you've a mind to tell me where the man is, I don't see how we can ask him. Miss Marple smiled. Oh, I think he'll turn up soon enough. Men who flee rarely plan ahead. Of course, a man on the run still needs food and shelter. Graves grumbled, but Miss Marple could tell he was listening. She had known from the moment she heard of Endicott's disappearance that he was not the type to concoct a well-executed escape. No, his was a flight born of panic-stricken, desperate, and clumsy, which meant he would not have gone far, and in a place like Hawthorne Hollow, someone would have seen him. While the inspector continued his investigation, Miss Marple paid a visit to the postmistress, Miss Abigail Grayson, a sharp-eyed woman with an ear for all local happenings. Miss Grayson had a habit of keeping mental notes on the comings and goings of villagers. "Ah, Miss Marple," she said with a knowing smile. "You're here about Mr. Endicott, I imagine?" "I thought you might have some useful information," Miss Marple admitted. Miss Grayson pursed her lips. "Oh, I do know that Mr. Endicott withdrew a sum of money from his savings just last week, a rather significant amount by his standards." Marple's eyebrows lifted. "How interesting. And did he say why?" "He did not," Miss Grayson replied, "but he looked troubled, very troubled." Miss Marple thanked her and made her way back to the village, considering this new piece of information. If Harold Endicott had taken out money before the murder, it meant that his troubles had not begun with Miss Bradshaw's death. They had preceded it, which meant there was something in his life, some pressing matter that might well have intersected with Miss Bradshaw's own affairs. Miss Marple rather thought she knew what it was. That evening, as Miss Marple strolled past the edge of the village green, she caught sight of something peculiar near the churchyard, half hidden in the deepening twilight. A figure was moving between the headstones, cautiously, furtively. Miss Marple did not call out. Instead, she simply watched. It was Harold Endicott. His once pristine suit was now wrinkled and dusty, and he carried a small satchel over one shoulder. He looked around nervously before slipping toward the back of the church, where a small storage shed stood. Miss Marple took her time walking back to the vicarage. She rather thought the inspector would like to know where his missing suspect had decided to hide. Less than an hour later, Inspector Graves, accompanied by a constable, strode purposefully toward the churchyard. When they reached the shed, the inspector knocked twice. Silence. Then a rustling from within. "Mr. Endicott," Graves called. "I suggest you open this door before we do." A long pause. Then, reluctantly, the door creaked open, revealing a disheveled and exhausted Harold Endicott. His eyes darted between the inspector and the constable, his posture rigid with tension. "You gave us quite the chase," Graves said. Dryly, Endicott swallowed. I didn't kill her." Graves exhaled, already weary. "That remains to be seen. Now, why don't you come with us and explain exactly why you ran?" Endicott hesitated, but seemed to realize he had little choice. He allowed himself to be led back to the vicarage, where he was seated once more in the study. Miss Marple arrived moments later, her presence unassuming yet undeniably commanding. "Well, Mr. Endicott," she said gently, "perhaps you would feel better if you told the truth. Running, you see, often makes people assume the worst." Endicott ran a shaking hand through his thinning hair. "I panicked, but I swear I had nothing to do with Miss Bradshaw's death." "Then why run?" Graves pressed. Endicott hesitated, his throat working. "Because I owed her money." Miss Marple's eyes glimmered with interest. "She lent me a sum months ago," he continued, "but she had begun to demand it back, firmly. She was threatening to expose me, humiliate me. I was supposed to meet with her that evening to discuss repayment, but when I heard she was dead," he exhaled, his expression haunted, "I thought people would suspect me. And when I saw the will, saw that Evelyn Howard had been named instead, I panicked. Inspector Graves studied him carefully. So, you admit to being in debt to her? Yes. And where were you at the time of her death? I was at the fete. In plain sight, Miss Marple considered this. This was true. Endicott had been visible for much of the afternoon. His debt to Miss Bradshaw might have been a source of stress, but was it enough for murder? Unlikely. Still, there was something else nagging at her, a missing piece that had yet to present itself. The next morning, Miss Marple paid another visit. Time to Mrs. Pembroke. The vicar's wife seemed surprised to see her. Miss Marple, what a pleasure. Miss Marple smiled. I had a thought, my dear, about that rather significant. Will change. Mrs. Pembroke hesitated, then sighed. Yes, it is strange, isn't it? More than strange, Miss Marple murmured. You see, my dear, I have been thinking Miss Bradshaw made that change very recently, and yet she did not inform Evelyn Howard, which suggests that her decision was reactionary. Wouldn't you agree? Mrs. Pembroke bit her lip. I suppose so. Miss Marple gave her a long, searching look. Is there something you haven't told me, Mrs. Pembroke? A pause. Then, with a shuddering breath, the vicar's wife admitted, I knew about Miss Bradshaw's argument that night, but I never imagined it would come to this. Miss Marple nodded encouragingly. Go on. Mrs. Pembroke's hands twisted in her lap. She had a visitor that night. Tara. The fate. A woman. Miss Marple's eyes sharpened, and I know who it was. Hawthorne Hollow awoke to another day steeped in uncertainty. The village, usually so still and predictable, now buzzed with murmured speculations about Harold Endicott's capture and the shocking revelation that Miss Bradshaw had altered her will mere days before her death. But it was Julia Harrington's late-night visit to the deceased that had truly set tongues wagging. Miss Marple had spent much of the night considering what she had learned. Julia had admitted to visiting Miss Bradshaw, claiming she had gone to warn her about the dangers of blackmailing Evelyn Howard. But Miss Marple knew that people rarely told the whole truth when it came to murder. They left things out, disguised details, convinced themselves that what they omitted did not matter. But omissions were where the truth often lay. The morning sun filtered through her lace curtains as she sipped her tea, her mind turning over the smallest of details. There was something here, something just beyond reach, a connection between Miss Bradshaw's actions and the night she died, one that tied together blackmail, a revised will, and a woman's desperate warning. And then there was the torn note. You must see reason before it is too late. Miss Marple turned it over once more. She had been so focused on who had written it that she had overlooked a simpler question. Had Miss Bradshaw read it? Or had it been discarded before she even saw it? She rose from her chair, straightened her hat, stepped out onto the cobbled path leading into the village. It was time to ask new questions. Her first stop was Miss Bradshaw's house, grand yet austere building on the edge of the village. The household staff had been given leave since the tragedy. But one woman remained, Mrs. Lacey, the longtime housekeeper, who had devoted nearly 20 years of her life to Miss Bradshaw's service. When Miss Marple arrived, Mrs. Lacey greeted her with tired eyes, ushering her inside with little more than a nod. I suppose you're here about what happened, she said, leading Miss Marple to the parlor, where the scent of lavender still clung to the air. Yes, my dear, I imagine you knew Miss Bradshaw better than most. Mrs. Lacey sighed, sinking into a chair. She was a hard woman, but fair in her own way. She kept to herself, except when she had cause to meddle. She liked to know things, Miss Marple, but I never thought it would lead to. She trailed off, pressing her lips together. Miss Marple studied her closely. My dear, on the night before she died, did Miss Bradshaw seem troubled? Mrs. Lacey hesitated, then nodded. Yes, she barely touched her supper. And then she had a visitor late in the evening. It's Julia Harrington." The housekeeper's eyes flickered with surprise. "Yes. How did you? Oh, just a little curiosity of mine." Mrs. Lacey shook her head. It was a strange meeting. They were in the study for some time. Miss Bradshaw's voice was sharp. I couldn't make out much, but she sounded amused, as if she were enjoying herself. Miss Marple's lips pursed, and Miss Harrington much quieter. "Okay." But there was a moment just before she left where I heard her say something quite clearly. Miss Marple leaned in ever so slightly. "And what was that, my dear?" Mrs. Lacey hesitated before speaking. "You'll regret this, Lavinia. I promise you that." Miss Marple absorbed the words, her expression unreadable. A promise. Not a threat, but a certainty. And within 24 hours, Miss Bradshaw had been dead. After leaving the Bradshaw house, Miss Marple made her way to the Green Man, where Julia Harrington often took tea in the afternoons. Sure enough, she was seated by the window, her fingers wrapped around a porcelain cup. Miss Marple took the seat opposite her without asking. Julia exhaled, setting her cup down. "I assume you've come to pry, Miss Marple." "No, my dear. I have come to understand." Julia smirked. "And what, pray, do you seek to understand?" Miss Marple folded her hands neatly. "Why you lied to me." A flicker of something fear crossed Julia's face, but she quickly masked it. "Lied? About what?" "About a great many things, I suspect. But most importantly, about your last words to Miss Bradshaw." Julia stiffened. "You see," Miss Marple continued pleasantly, "I spoke with Mrs. Lacey, and she overheard something most curious when you left that night. You told Miss Bradshaw that she would regret this. That does not sound like the words of a woman merely delivering a warning." Julia inhaled sharply. Mrs. Lacey misunderstood. "Oh, I don't think she did, my dear." Julia's jaw tightened. "I had no reason to want Lavinia dead." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "On the contrary, my dear, you had every reason." Julia's hand trembled slightly before she clenched it into a fist. "I didn't kill her." Miss Marple tilted her head. "Perhaps not with your own hands. But that does not mean you are innocent." For the first time, Julia's composure cracked. She shoved back her chair, her expression unreadable. "You don't know what you're talking about, Miss Marple." And with that, she left the inn without another word. Miss Marple watched her go, a quiet certainty settling in her chest. Julia Harrington was hiding something, and Miss Marple now had an idea of what it was. That evening, Miss Marple returned home, turning once more to the torn note. If Julia Harrington had known about Miss Bradshaw's blackmail scheme, had she been the one to write the warning, or had someone else? Her musings were interrupted by a knock at the door. When she opened it, she found Evelyn Howard standing there, her face pale. "Miss Marple," she said, her voice shaking, "I need your help." Miss Marple stepped aside, allowing the young woman to enter. "What troubles you, my dear?" Evelyn swallowed hard. "Someone's been watching me." Miss Marple's brows lifted. "Oh," Evelyn nodded, glancing toward the darkened street. "I keep seeing a man lurking near the school, near my cottage. I think he's following me." Miss Marple's expression remained calm, but her mind was already working. Had Evelyn's secret come back to haunt her? Or was someone ensuring that she never had the chance to tell the truth? As Evelyn sat in the parlor, Miss Marple considered the possibilities. Someone was growing nervous. Someone wanted Evelyn silenced, and that meant the case was about to take a very dangerous turn. Miss Marple adjusted her lace gloves and smiled. It was time to set a little trap. Evelyn Howard sat stiffly in Miss Marple's parlor, her hands clenched tightly in her lap. The soft glow of the oil lamp illuminated the worry in her eyes. The tension in her frame spoke of a fear she had not yet fully admitted. Miss Marple, ever the picture of calm, poured tea into 2 delicate china cups, adding just the right amount of sugar and milk before passing one to Evelyn. "My dear," she said gently, "why don't you start at the beginning?" Evelyn took a shaky breath. "I first noticed him 3 days ago, always at a distance, watching. At first, I thought I was imagining things, but then," she hesitated, glancing toward the window as if she half expected to see a figure standing in the darkness. Miss Marple sipped her tea. "You saw him again?" Evelyn nodded. "Near the schoolhouse. Then again, outside my cottage, late last night. When I turned the corner, I saw him disappear into the trees. He knows I've seen him, and now," she exhaled shakily, "I don't know what he wants." Miss Marple set down her cup, her expression thoughtful. "My dear, do you suppose this man is connected to Miss Bradshaw's death?" Evelyn flinched at the name. I don't know, but something tells me it's not a coincidence." Miss Marple studied the young woman carefully. Evelyn had been at the heart of this case from the beginning, beneficiary of the altered will, target of Miss Bradshaw's blackmail, and now, seemingly, is the object of some unknown watcher's interest. But was she a victim, or was there more to her story than she was letting on? Miss Marple decided that it was time to set her plan in motion. The next morning, Miss Marple took a leisurely stroll through the village, making polite conversation with the butcher's wife, exchanging greetings with the vicar, and stopping for a moment's rest near the village green. In truth, she was watching. Somewhere, hidden among the ordinary villagers, was the man who had been watching Evelyn Howard. By midday, her patience was rewarded. Near the corner of the post office, standing just beyond the line of trees, was a figure tall, broad-shouldered, dressed in a plain brown overcoat. He was not remarkable at first glance, but the way he held himself, the way he lingered just outside the natural flow of the village, made it clear that he did not belong. Miss Marple turned and began walking toward the market, seemingly preoccupied with her shopping. She did not need to look back to know that the man was moving as well, slowly, deliberately, staying just far enough away to avoid attention. She had her answer. The man was following Evelyn, and now he was following Miss Marple. That evening, Inspector Graves arrived at Miss Marple's cottage. Expression one of frustration. "We've traced Harold Endicott's finances, Kay," he announced, settling heavily into a chair. "Turns out he withdrew that money for a very specific reason, Miss. Bradshaw was threatening to expose him for mismanaging church funds." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled, a rather delicate way of saying she was accusing him of theft. Graves grunted. "Precisely. But it was more than that. Cott insists he didn't steal a penny, but that Miss Bradshaw was forcing him to cover up something for her." Miss Marple set her knitting down. "Now, that is interesting. What, I wonder, was she so desperate to hide?" Graves sighed, rubbing his temples. "We're working on it. Meanwhile, I have another problem." Graves' expression darkened. "A man matching the description Evelyn gave us was seen arriving at Market Chipping Station a few days before Miss Bradshaw's murder." Miss Marple's brows lifted. "And do we know who he is?" Graves hesitated. "We do. His name is Robert Fletcher." Kalen, who had been silent until now, made a choked sound. Miss Marple turned to her. "Ah, I take it that name is familiar." My dear Evelyn's face had gone pale. "He's my stepbrother." Silence settled over the room like a thick fog dot. Graves recovered first. "Care to explain why your stepbrother has been lurking about the village without making himself known?" Evelyn swallowed. "I don't know." Miss Marple simply watched her, waiting. Finally, Evelyn exhaled. "Robert and we haven't spoken in years. After our mother died, he left for London. I had no idea he was here." Graves crossed his arms. "Well, he is. And he's been watching you." Miss Marple tapped a finger lightly against the armrest of her chair. "My dear, does your stepbrother have any connection to Miss Bradshaw?" Evelyn hesitated. "No, at least, I don't think so." But Miss Marple saw that flicker of something in Evelyn's eyes. Not quite a lie, but certainly not the full truth. Later that evening, as the village settled into the quiet hush of dusk, Miss Marple made her way toward Evelyn's cottage. She did not need a police constable or a heavy walking stick for protection. Miss Marple's greatest weapon was always her unassuming nature. She reached the gate and paused. A figure stood just beyond the garden hedge. Robert Fletcher. He was taller than she had expected, with a hard-set jaw and eyes that carried years of wariness. He turned as she approached, his shoulders tensing. "Miss Marple," he said, his voice low. Miss Marple smiled pleasantly. "Mr. Fletcher, a pleasure to make your acquaintance." Studied her for a long moment, then exhaled. "Suppose you know why I'm here?" "Oh, I might have a few ideas," Miss Marple admitted. "But I do think it would be much more useful if you told me yourself." Robert's hands clenched at his sides. "Grant killer." Miss Marple nodded. "I believe you." That startled him. "You do?" "Yes. But you were looking for something, weren't you?" Robert hesitated. Then, after a long moment, he muttered, "Yes." Miss Marple tilted her head. "And did you find it?" Robert exhaled, shaking his head. "No, but someone else did." Miss Marple's eyes gleamed. "Now, that is a very interesting thing to say." Robert Fletcher had not come to Hawthorne Hollow for revenge. He had come for proof. That night, as Miss Marple sat by her fire, she considered what she had learned. Robert Fletcher was not the murderer, but his presence in the village, his search for something that had once belonged to Miss Bradshaw meant that the truth was far from settled. And somewhere, the real killer was growing desperate. The noose was tightening. It would not be long before they made their final, fatal mistake. Miss Marple smiled softly to herself. She would be waiting. Miss Marple had always believed that in matters of murder, the past was never truly buried. This crime, as deliberate as Miss Bradshaw's poisoning, did not spring from a moment of passion. It was the culmination of something long festering, something that had taken root in secrecy and deceit. Now, sitting by her hearth with her knitting in her lap, Miss Marple felt the weight of that truth more than ever. Robert Fletcher had come to Hawthorne Hollow searching for something. He had not been watching Evelyn out of malice, but out of necessity. And his words, "I didn't find it, someone else did," it had lingered in Miss Marple's mind long after their conversation. What had he been looking for? And more importantly, who had already found it? The next morning, Miss Marple paid a visit to Evelyn Howard. The young woman answered the door with dark circles under her eyes, her nerves clearly frayed. "I hope I'm not intruding, my dear," Miss Marple said kindly. Evelyn forced a smile. "Not at all, Miss Marple. Please, come in." The cottage was small but tidy, the only sign of distress being an overturned book on the sitting room table and a cold, half-finished cup of tea. Evelyn gestured for Miss Marple to sit, then perched uneasily on the edge of the armchair. "I had a conversation with your stepbrother last night," Miss Marple began. Evelyn stiffened. "Robert? Yes, my dear, is quite forthcoming about his reasons for being here. But I do think there's more you might tell me." Evelyn swallowed hard, her gaze darting away. I don't know what he told you, but I really don't, my dear." Miss Marple interrupted gently. "I do understand how difficult this must be, but the truth has a way of coming out, whether we invite it or not." Evelyn was silent for a long moment. Then, with a heavy sigh, she finally spoke. "It's about our mother," she admitted. Miss Marple inclined her head, waiting. "She died when I was very young," Evelyn continued, her voice strained. "Robert was older. He remembered more. But what I do remember is that Miss Bradshaw was involved somehow. She and my mother had some kind of falling out before she died." Miss Marple's knitting needles clicked softly in the silence. "And did Robert ever tell you what it was about?" Evelyn shook her head. "No, but I always knew it was something bad, something he never wanted to talk about." She exhaled shakily. Miss Bradshaw knew something about our mother, and I think she used it against Robert. Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. Which would explain why she was blackmailing you. Evelyn flinched, but nodded. I don't know what she had, but she threatened me. Said if I didn't do exactly as she asked, she would ruin me. I was desperate, Miss Marple. I begged Julia Harrington to speak to her to try and convince her to stop. Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. And then, just a few days before her death, she changed her will in your favor. Evelyn's breath hitched. I don't understand. Why? I didn't ask her to. She was dead and, suddenly, I'm the one everyone is looking at. Miss Marple smiled kindly. That does seem rather unfair, doesn't it? Evelyn let out a shuddering breath. Miss Marple, do think I killed her? Miss Marple patted her hand gently. No, my dear. I don't believe someone wanted it to look that way. And she had an idea who that someone was that afternoon. Miss Marple returned to the Bradshaw house. It's time, under the pretense of gathering some of Miss Bradshaw's belongings for the vicarage charity sale. Mrs. Lacey, the housekeeper, welcomed her with a tired sigh. I never thought I'd see the day, Miss Marple. This house feels so empty now. Yes, dear, Miss Marple said absent-mindedly, her eyes already scanning the study. Such a tragedy. Mrs. Lacey led her into the room where Miss Bradshaw had died, and for a moment Miss Marple simply stood, letting her eyes take in every detail: the teacup, the desk, the fireplace, the locked cabinet. Her gaze lingered on the last. She turned to Mrs. Lacey. My dear, did Miss Bradshaw ever keep important documents locked away? Oh, certainly, Mrs. Lacey said. She was very particular about her private papers. Kept them in that cabinet over there, had the only key. Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. And do you know where that key is now? Mrs. Lacey hesitated. It should be with her things. Miss Marple smiled. Would you mind terribly if I had a look? Mrs. Lacey retrieved a small ring of keys from a drawer and handed them over. Miss Marple tested one in the cabinet lock, and with a soft click, the door swung open. Inside was a neatly arranged row of files, some labeled in Miss Bradshaw's sharp handwriting. And there, near the back, was an envelope with a name scrawled. Across the front, Margaret Howard. Miss Marple's eyes gleamed. Margaret Howard, Evelyn and Robert's mother. Carefully, she withdrew the envelope and opened it. Inside were a handful of letters, yellowed with age, and a single folded document. Miss Marple's hands were steady as she unfolded it. Her breath caught. A marriage certificate, and not just any marriage certificate. It bore the name of Margaret Howard beneath it. The name of a groom Miss Marple knew well, Harold Endicott. Miss Marple set the document down carefully, her mind worry. Harold Endicott had been married to Evelyn and Robert's mother. That meant that Evelyn was not just a simple schoolteacher with no ties to Miss Bradshaw. She was, legally, Harold Endicott's stepdaughter. And if Miss Bradshaw had been blackmailing Evelyn, she had been blackmailing her with the truth of her own identity. Miss Marple exhaled slowly. Miss Bradshaw had always been a woman who collected secrets, and she had held onto this one for years. But something had changed. She had rewritten her will. Had she been about to reveal this secret instead of use it? And if so, had someone killed her to keep it buried? Miss Marple glanced back at the cabinet, her sharp blue eyes flickering with certainty. This was it. The key to everything. And now, she knew exactly who had killed Miss Bradshaw. All that was left was to prove it. That evening, Miss Marple paid a final visit to Inspector Graves. She placed the marriage certificate on his desk with a satisfied smile. There you are, Inspector, she said brightly. I believe we now have everything we need. Graves frowned. To prove who killed Miss Bradshaw. Miss Marple's smile deepened. Oh no, Inspector. We already know who killed her. Graves sat forward, his eyes sharp. Then, What is this for? Miss Marple's voice was soft but certain. This, Inspector, is how we make them confess. Inspector Graves frowned at the marriage certificate resting on his desk. He traced the names with a calloused finger, his brow furrowed in thought. This changes things, he muttered. Miss Marple, seated comfortably across from him, folded her hands in her lap and nodded. It does rather put matters into perspective, doesn't it? Graves leaned back in his chair, exhaling slowly. So, Harold Endicott was married to Evelyn and Robert Fletcher's mother. And somehow, Miss Bradshaw knew. Oh, she knew, Miss Marple said. And, I believe, she used that knowledge to her advantage until something changed. Graves rubbed his chin. The will, case Cecily, Miss Marple said with a small smile. Miss Bradshaw was a woman who liked to be in control. Inspector. She held secrets like cards in a game, playing them when it suited her. But she made one critical mistake. She underestimated how dangerous a secret can become when the person holding it decides to change the rules. Graves drummed his fingers against the desk. So, you believe that someone Endicott, Evelyn, or even Robert killed her to keep this hidden? Miss Marple adjusted the lace cuff of her sleeve. Perhaps. Or perhaps someone else feared. What Miss Bradshaw was about to do with this information. Tell me, Inspector, have you ever known a blackmailer to suddenly become benevolent? Graves frowned. No, doesn't happen. Exactly, Miss Marple said. Which means Miss Bradshaw must have had a reason for rewriting her will, a reason that went beyond mere charity. Graves nodded. She wasn't just holding the secret anymore. She was planning to expose it. Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. And that, Inspector, is what got her killed. As the evening settled over Hawthorne Hollow, Miss Marple took a stroll through the village, her mind turning over the final details of her plan. She knew the killer was growing nervous soon. They would be forced to act. Her next stop was the Green Man. The inn was lively that evening. Villagers gathering to exchange theories over pints of ale and plates of steaming stew. Miss Marple wove her way through the chatter until she spotted Julia Harrington seated in a shadowed corner. Miss Harrington. Miss Marple greeted pleasantly, coolly, lowering herself into the seat opposite. Julia looked up sharply, her fingers tightening around her glass. Miss Marple. Miss Marple smiled. It has been quite the ordeal, hasn't it? Julia exhaled, shaking her head. You don't need to tell me. Miss Marple studied her carefully. I understand you were close to Evelyn's mother. Julia flinched, just slightly, before recovering. We were friends, long ago. Before or after she married Harold Endicott. Julia's grip on her glass turned white-knuckled. You know? Miss Marple tilted her head. I had to think I do. Yes. And I also think that Miss Bradshaw intended to reveal the truth. Tell me, my dear, how far would you have gone to stop her? Julia's face drained of color. I didn't kill her. Miss Marple took a slow sip of tea. Then tell me, Julia, who did? Julia looked away, her breath unsteady. I don't know. Miss Marple watched her for a long moment before nodding. Then I suppose we must let the truth come out on its own. Julia's gaze snapped to hers. What do you mean? Miss Marple's smile was mild, but there was something sharp beneath it. Tomorrow evening, Inspector Graves will be calling. Together, everyone with a connection to Miss Bradshaw's affairs. The will, the blackmail, the debt will all be laid bare. Julia's hand trembled slightly as she set down her glass. Miss Marple studied her reaction, then rose. I do hope you'll attend, my dear. It would be most enlightening. She turned, leaving Julia staring after her, pale and silent. The following evening, the vicarage was filled with tense anticipation. Inspector Graves had summoned a select group to the study. Harold Endicott, Evelyn Howard, Robert Fletcher, Julia Harrington, and Mrs. Pembroke. Miss Marple arrived precisely on time. Glancing around at the anxious faces, Inspector Graves cleared his throat. "We've gathered you all here because new information has come to light about Miss Bradshaw's murder." A ripple of unease passed through the group. "Miss Marple," Graves said, nodding to her. "Would you care to explain?" Miss Marple smiled gladly, Inspector. She turned to the group. "Miss Bradshaw, as we all know, was a woman who collected secrets. She wielded them with great precision, but she made a fatal error. She misjudged her own power." She let that sink in before continuing. "The recent change to her will was not an act of generosity. It was an act of retribution. Akeda she had uncovered. A truth so shocking that she felt compelled to correct an old wrong." Evelyn swallowed hard. "You mean the marriage certificate?" Miss Marple nodded. "Indeed. Seems Miss Bradshaw had proof that your mother, Margaret Howard, was legally married to Harold Endicott. And yet, this was kept hidden from you." Harold Endicott, his face red, stood abruptly. This is nonsense. Teat doesn't change anything." Miss Marple smiled at him. "Oh, but it does, Mr. Endicott, because had this been made public, you would have been forced to admit that Evelyn is your legal stepdaughter, and therefore she might have had a claim to your estate." A heavy silence filled the room. Inspector Graves stepped forward. "And that, Endicott, is a damn good motive for murder." Endicott sputtered, looking around wildly. I didn't kill her." "Yes, she threatened me, but I swear I had nothing to do with her death." Miss Marple sighed. "No, I don't believe you did, Mr. Endicott." He blinked in shock. "You don't?" Miss Marple turned her gaze to Julia Harrington. "But you, my dear, I believe, did, eh?" A gasp rippled through the room. Julia's face went deathly pale. "That's absurd." Miss Marple's voice was soft but unyielding. "You knew Miss Bradshaw intended to reveal the truth. You knew it would unravel everything you had tried to protect. And so, you poisoned her." Julia's breath came in shallow bursts. You warned her the night before," Miss Marple continued. "And when she laughed in your face, you realized you had no other choice." Julia's hands trembled. "You can't prove that." Miss Marple's smile was almost sympathetic. "I don't need to, my dear, because I rather think you will." A silence fell. Then Julia let out a strangled sound, burying her face in her hands. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, I killed her." The room exhaled collectively. Inspector Graves stepped forward. "Julia Harrington, you are under arrest for the murder of Lavinia Bradshaw." Miss Marple let out a quiet breath as the final piece of the puzzle fell into place. Justice had been served, and Hawthorne Hollow, at last, could rest. The morning after Julia Harrington's arrest, Hawthorne Hollow buzzed with the news. The village, ever hungry for scandal, had turned the vicarage gathering into legend overnight. By the time Miss Marple took her usual morning walk, she was greeted with the knowing glances and hurried whispers, each villager eager to discuss the case in hushed, conspiratorial tones. She seemed such a refined woman, Mrs. Weatherby muttered to Mrs. Willoughby near the bakery. "Indeed, Mrs. Willoughby agreed, shaking her head. "It's poison. Such a womanly crime." At the Green Man, Colonel Marchbanks was giving his opinion to a captive audience. Always said there was something off about her, a bit too clever for her own good. "Can't trust a woman who reads too much." Miss Marple, seated quietly by the window, simply smiled. She had solved many murders in her time, and she knew well that once a culprit was named, people were always eager to claim they had suspected it all along. Inspector Graves, who had arrived earlier to tidy up the official details, was finishing his breakfast across from her. He set his tea down with a sigh. "Well, Miss Marple, you've done it again." Miss Marple looked up, her expression mild. "Oh, I wouldn't say that, Inspector." The truth was there for anyone to see. Graves huffed. "Perhaps you were the only one who did." Miss Marple took a delicate sip of tea. "Human nature, Inspector, is rather like a tapestry. Most people only see the picture on the front, but the real story is in the knots and tangles at the back. Graves smirked. And you, Miss Marple, have a gift for turning the tapestry around. She chuckled softly, but her expression remained thoughtful. Tell me, Inspector, what will happen to Julia? Graves sighed. She'll be charged, of course. She's confessed. No jury will have much sympathy for a woman who poisons her victim in cold blood. Miss Marple nodded. No, I suppose not. But there was a shadow in her eyes. She had seen many murderers brought to justice, but few had looked as haunted as Julia Harrington. There was something deeply tragic in her final whispered confession, and yet justice was justice. Later that afternoon, Miss Marple visited Evelyn Howard. The young woman had been shaken by the truth about Miss Bradshaw, about her own past, and about the woman who had tried to protect her in the only way she knew how. She did it for me, didn't she? Evelyn murmured as she poured tea with unsteady hands. Miss Marple was quiet for a moment. Yes, my dear, I believe she did. Evelyn exhaled, shaking her head. Julia was my mother's closest friend. She must have known all along about my real connection to Harold Endicott. Yes, Miss Marple agreed, but she never told you. She wanted to protect you from the truth. And she believed that if Miss Bradshaw revealed everything, it would ruin your life. Evelyn swallowed hard, but I would never have killed for it. Miss Marple reached over and patted her hand. No, my dear. But fear and love make people do desperate things. Julia thought she was saving you from scandal, from disgrace, perhaps even from yourself. Evelyn pressed a hand to her temple. And now she's in prison. Miss Marple sighed. Yes, dear, that is the way of things. There was nothing more to be done. The truth had been laid bare, and the weight of it rested heavily on all those left behind. A week later, the village had begun to settle. The scandal of Miss Bradshaw's murder had lost its sharpness, fading into the background of daily life. Miss Marple sat in her garden, enjoying the crisp autumn air as she stitched the hem of a new tea cozy. The world had returned to its usual, predictable rhythm-baking competitions, church gatherings, and whispered gossip about things far less dire than murder. Inspector Graves had sent word that Julia Harrington was to stand trial, and there was little doubt about the outcome. A tragic end, but an inevitable one. Evelyn Howard had quietly left the village. Some said she had gone to London, others that she had traveled abroad. Miss Marple suspected that she simply wished to start over far away from the ghosts of the past. Harold Endicott, though cleared of suspicion, had resigned from his position as church treasurer. He had become something of a pariah, though whether that was due to his financial misdeeds or his general unpleasantness was debatable. As for Robert Fletcher, he had vanished just as mysteriously as he had arrived. Miss Marple suspected that he had no desire to linger in a place that held so many painful memories, and so Hawthorne Hollow returned to its quiet existence. But Miss Marple, ever perceptive, knew that the village had changed in some small, imperceptible way. Trust had been shaken, old wounds had been reopened, and the echoes of the past had found their way into the present. She took a sip of tea, her gaze thoughtful. It was a curious thing. Murder left scars not only on the dead, but on the living, and yet life went on. Miss Marple set down her cup and picked up her knitting once more. There would always be another puzzle to solve, and she would be ready.